My name is Thomas Flores, and I'm, amongst other things, the chair of Oded Adomi Leshem's Dissertation Committee, and we're here, of course, for his defense today, along with Jim Witte and Kevin Avruch. I'm very happy to be here today. This is a bittersweet day because it's both an exciting day where Adomi's work is recognized. Years of work are recognized today, but also a sad day for all of us who are sort of an end of one thing, a beginning of another, but the end of one thing. We introduced Adomi. While he gets started, we'll have Adomi make a presentation of the work, and then I think I'll allow my colleagues on the committee to ask questions first, and I'll kind of I'll sort of back clean up, so to speak, and then we'll kind of yield for questions from our audience. Let me introduce Adomi. Oded Leshem holds a BA in Education and an MA in Conflict Resolution and Mediation from Tel Aviv University. He's a certified mediator. He has been a documentary filmmaker, having been a graduate of Sam Spiegel Film School in Jerusalem. His documentary Voices from El Sayed in 2008 is one of the notable accomplishments of that phase of his life. But of course, that wasn't enough. It sort of Adomi sort of reached this phase of his, having had a successful career already as a filmmaker. Adomi reached this phase of his life and said, "You know what? I'm going to go get a PhD in conflict resolution and social psychology." Along with his very wonderful spouse, moved to Rockville, where he started his work here, where he instantly became, for me, a fixture of this place and a very accomplished student. His work has already been published in multiple peer-reviewed journals, and he has, as you're going to hear a little bit today, fielded experiments and very rigorous surveys examining hope in Israel and Palestine over the last about 3 years. And so the work, I think, is just incredibly interesting. I'm very, very happy for us to be here today. So with no further ado, Adomi.
Okay, so thanks, Thomas, for this introduction, and thanks a lot for coming this morning. I'm very happy to introduce my dissertation project, which is titled The Role of Hope During Intractable Conflicts. First, I want to acknowledge the great help and support and encouragement I got from the committee members, and first and foremost from the chair, Dr. Thomas Flores, and of course from Professor Jim Witte and Professor Kevin Avruch, that were really encouraging and mentored me through the whole process. And I want to also acknowledge the help and the support from my family. Yasmin was supposed to be here, but at the last minute she couldn't come. But they were really helpful, of course, Yasmin and the kids. And I also want to acknowledge the community of peace builders in Israel, Palestine, Palestinian Israeli peace builders that were in many ways their work, our work. I include myself in this, as I was involved in peace building in Israel for more than a decade. So our work in many ways inspired this project and is aimed to feed back into peace building work in Israel, Palestine, and other conflict zones. And I will talk about that a little bit later. So I'll start by just a brief outline of the presentation today. I'm first going to talk about the social psychological infrastructure of intractable conflicts, which is the main theoretical prism by which I analyze conflict and try to understand their dynamics. So I'll talk a little bit about that and then present the problem and the research questions that derive from this problem, so the main problem that I'm going to focus on. Then I'm going to talk about hope. We use this word on a daily basis, but we rarely have the opportunity to understand what it means and how does it function in the life of individuals and society. So I'll talk about hope and then present my empirical research on hope and hope inducement, and then finish with talking about the implications of these studies and some further directions that I have on researching hope. But I'll first start by talking about how this project originated. So if you come from conflict zones, certainly if you come from Israel, you know that the conflict can never be resolved, right? This is one of the assumptions that people live with. and you could hear it everywhere. You could see it in the media, you could hear it on the streets, at dinner tables, at family dinners. People assume that the conflict is inherently resolvable. And most of the people, that's their assumption, except for a segment of people, a sector of people, of peace builders, and everyone that is engaged in some way in proactive or deliberate activities towards peace in Israel-Palestine. And one of the things that differ these two groups is that the people that are working for peace can imagine an alternative future. And this is rare in these circumstances. So these people could imagine the conflict absent and peace present. And that what differs from the society. And working and being involved in these activities in many ways exposed me. And I was a part of these people that have a different perceptions of the future. So that really led me to study how people perceive the future. My work is anchored in the future and people's perception of the future. And the second origin of this project is my love to social psychology. So I started to learn social psychology and really quickly was attracted to the way that social psychology could decipher how conflicts, certainly intractable conflicts, how they develop, how they evolve, and also offer some ways how to mitigate their detrimental ramifications. So both social psychology and being involved in peace building led me to study hope and hopelessness, of course. So just talking a little bit about the social psychological infrastructure of intractable conflicts. One of the things that we know about these conflicts, like the conflict between Israel and Palestine and the conflict between Israel and Palestine and India and Pakistan and the conflict in Cyprus and in other places, is that these conflicts start with a dispute over some material resources. It could be land, it could be water, other resources. But very quickly, these conflicts develop into a very elaborate system of conflicts over intangible resources, like national identity, like sacred values, like national pride. These things are very hard to negotiate or divide or share. And very quickly, what happens is that during the course of the conflict, the parties develop a very rigid and stable social psychological infrastructures of beliefs and emotions towards the outgroup, of course, hostile emotions towards and beliefs towards the outgroup, emotions toward themselves, so like in-group favoritism, and some beliefs about the nature of the conflict. And as the conflict prolongs, this social psychological infrastructure becomes the core of the conflict, becomes the anchor for the conflict, not the tangible resources that maybe initiate the conflict in the first place. So for example, when you see a conflict, a bitter conflict between siblings that might have started because there was some disagreement about an item in the will of the parents or something like that. But it could evolve into a very detrimental and hostile set of beliefs and emotions. Then afterwards, even if you could solve this item and reach some agreement, the conflict will not be resolved because the hostility and aggression is so deeply ingrained, sometimes over several generations. And this is why intractable conflicts are so hard to resolve, and this is also why I think social psychology and looking at those attitudes and beliefs and emotions is our way into understanding intractable conflicts and maybe also resolving them. One of these beliefs, just one of them, is that the conflict is inherently irresolvable, and this is my topic of observation and examination during the years, during this dissertation project. And if I want to go into and really understand what that means, so group members just take the conflict as a given. When they imagine the future, they imagine the conflict always present, so stretching into the far future. Unfortunately, and maybe ironically, this perception also has a palliative effect because it addresses our need for certainty and predictability. So we know how the conflict looks like. It's been here for decades. And it's easier to imagine that just continuing than start to engage in a very elaborate and taxing and creative thinking about an alternative future. So in many ways, it's easier to understand that the conflict will go on forever than start to imagine something that we don't know how it looks like. We don't know how peace looks like in intractable conflicts. So it has a very tragic effect that is also soothing in many ways. But also leaders can benefit from encouraging the skeptical outlook of the future, because, for example, if everybody is skeptical, then no one pushes the government to make any, for negotiations or to make any concessions. Everybody is skeptical, and leaders, of course, could benefit and actually in Israel-Palestine encourage this skeptical outlook. And over time, this perception becomes a truism, because something that no one criticizes or questions. So we could ask, okay, what's the big deal? Why is it so bad to have no hope for peace? Maybe it's just a realistic understanding of the future trajectory of the conflict. But what I try to investigate in my dissertation is this cyclical pattern of self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if everybody is hopeless about the feasibility of resolution, there should be no incentive, no preconditioned motivation to work for peace in any way. It could be engaging, just listening to the other's perspective. It could be pushing the government to negotiate. It could be anything, but there is no, the precondition for believing that it's possible is absent. So no one is working for peace. And then at the aggregate, the conflict just will persist. And of course, revalidate this perception that the conflict can never be resolved. So this is a very tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy that I try to investigate in my dissertation. But what I also try to do is see if we could disturb this cycle by some intervention that directly challenges this perceived irreconcilability. So the question is, could we intervene at the point where people are making their judgment about the feasibility of peace, and then see if that also changes in some way or disturbs in some way this cycle? Maybe like the ideal part was to really reverse this cycle. So high hopes, a lot of work for peace, the conflict mitigates, more hope, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the questions, the research questions that derive from this problem? First of all, we really need to gauge if people are hopeless or have hope for resolution, because the theory, that's what the theory about intractable conflicts argues, but it was never accurately assessed in the context of intractable conflict. So what are the levels of hope for peace among those that are living in an intractable conflict, and how stable is this belief? So does that fluctuate according to the different political circumstances that happen during conflict? So one way to see it is that when there is a surge of violence, okay, which happens unfortunately on a regular basis, then the hopes will fall, and then but there are some hints of the prospects for peace, then hopes for peace will rise. Another way to look at it is that hopelessness is more chronic, is more stable, and is a defining feature of intractability that would not really fluctuate in small changes during the conflict. So that's another thing I wanted to investigate. And then the third question is, what interventions, if any, could induce hope for peace? Could we intervene and challenge this very rigid belief of irreconcilability? And will these interventions actually withstand conflict escalation? One of the things that we know about conflict interventions is that we want them to last or have some sort of durability. This is true for any conflict intervention, certainly when we are trying to increase hope for peace. So I've been talking a lot about hope, but I didn't really talk what hope is. And in my dissertation, I used two approaches or two lenses to understand what hope is. The first one is a more philosophical exploration about hope. What is hope? What is hope's function in the life of the individual, in the life of society? Is hope valued the same across cultures and across the political spectrum? Is being hopeful always a merit? Maybe being too hopeful has its dangerous consequences. So one a way to explore hope is to explore it through philosophy and mainly through social and political thought. And I will expand about that a little bit later. And the second exploration was through a psychological approach, because at the end I needed to measure it. I wanted to understand what the components are in order to tap citizens' hope in the context of conflict. So I'll start with trying to explain what hope is through the prism of psychological inquiry. And most of the research, and maybe what we could also understand intuitively, is that hope is comprised of two main components that are essential in order to hope. The first one is some wish to attain a goal, and the other one is some expectation that this goal may be obtained. So a desire for something, the wish for something, is the first prerequisite in order for us to hope. Of course, we can't hope for something that we don't want. And the second thing is we have to have some expectation, not certainty, of course, but some expectation that it could be reached. So, for example, I might wish to be an astronaut and join NASA and fly to the moon. I might have a very great desire for that, and maybe if this dissertation doesn't go through well and I don't get a PhD, I might consider changing the career. But I might wish it, but because currently my expectations are so low, are zero, I don't hope to do it or to achieve it. On the flip side, I might be parking in a no parking zone and expect to get a parking ticket, but I certainly don't hope to get a parking ticket because my wish is zero. Okay, so I need both of these components. They have to be present, and actually they qualify each other in order for me to hope. The second, or the third feature, the third component is an affective component, which is the pleasant feeling of excitement. This is the emotional manifestation of being hopeful, so we could also tap and are supposed to observe some emotional manifestation of being hopeful, this excitement when we are imagining the future. And the fourth component is some behavioral component, some behavioral outcome of being hopeful. We expect to see people proactive in their pursuit of the things that they hope for. Many times we critically judge people. They just say, I hope that something happened, but they are completely passive. They don't work or commit to do anything, and we critically judge them. So these four components are things that I wanted to look out for and to try to gauge when I was observing and measuring peace in conflict. But looking at hope as a social-political concept was also very important for me to try to understand what hope means in the political world and in the social world. And one of the things through my really reading these scholars and reading this work was tremendously inspiring. And one of the main themes is that hope is not only an outcome of social change, it's also one of its sources. So they were talking about hope initiates social change and how hope is essential for any social and political progress. And just quoting here, I could have talked about all of these scholars, but just quoting William Barber, I heard him 2 days ago in the March on Poverty in the Washington Mall. I was there, and he was very inspiring. In his books and his writing, he talks about the necessity to practice hope as an essential component to achieve social change. So anyone that is struggling for any social change must practice hope, because many times we lose it, but that's a prerequisite. This is something essential for anybody that is working, or any group or any society that wants to change its future. So hope is central according to Barber, but also Eric Fromm from the Frankfurt School. He wrote extensively about hope and how the active component is essential. Not only he says that hope is an activity by its very essence. So if one wishes for salvation or revolution but does nothing but wait for it to come, one is not really hoping. So activeness is an essential part. And really this assumption or this approach of looking at hope as a source of change inspired me to do these interventions and inspired me to see if we could increase hope for peace and then see if there are any positive consequences. going into the context of Israel-Palestine, why Israelis and Palestinians are so hopeless, it's quite understandable, actually, because in the 100 years of conflict, maybe more, there had been really short instances where there was the violence subsided and there were any prospects of peace. We could talk about the peace process between Israel and Egypt. We could talk about maybe the first Oslo years, 93, 94. These are the times when violence subsided. Otherwise, violence is always present. Just 3 days ago, 50 rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel proper. IDF retaliated aggressively, like always. So violence is always present on a day-to-day basis, and that lends this perception that it will just never stop. Okay, people see violence and conflict as such the omnipresent is so great that they just perceive that it will never stop. Secondly, it has become one of the core pillars of the national identity that there is opposition to the other. So in many ways, these two national movements were born and like at the same time and in many ways evolved as a mirror image of each other. So animosity to the other side has become a core pillar of the identity of each society. And the antagonism is so high and so embedded in the national identity that seeking peace with these hated enemies is just unimaginable. So national identity is the other reason, or the second reason why people are so hopeless. And thirdly, there had been multiple attempts by the international community to intervene, and in many ways these interventions failed, and that of course reduced the hope for peace, or hopes were dashed when these interventions were proved futile. So we could expect the levels of hope for peace to be low. But actually, the several attempts to measure hope that were, by the way, mostly concentrated on the Jewish Israeli society, because it's very difficult to study the Palestinian society in the occupied territories. So most of the literature actually shows mixed results. Some studies show that the hopes were high for peace, and some studies show that the hopes were low. And when I scrutinized the studies, I looked at the questionnaires, I looked at the data, I really looked deep into try to find all the data about these studies. At first I thought, okay, it makes sense. There were some times in the history of the conflict that hopes were high, and some other times when hopes were low. But actually the problem was methodological. It was conceptual, because when you look at the answers, you see that some participants were actually reflecting about their wishes for peace. When the researcher asked, what are your hopes for peace? They were reflecting high hopes because they had high wishes. They really wanted it. In other studies, the question was identical, but people were talking about what their expectations was. And we know from English that we, in day-to-day life, we use hope both as wish and expectation. This is true in Hebrew and Arabic as well. So the problem was methodological, and I wanted to rectify this problem by separately gauging wishes for peace and expectations for peace. And this confusion really, so far in the literature, has the consequence is that we can't know what hopes are high, if hopes are low or high in Israel-Palestine. So now going back into my own investigation and my own exploration of hope for peace. So I use this conceptualization of hope as a four-component construct and set out to do two studies. The first study was a two-wave survey conducted in Israel on Jewish Israeli population, trying to assess citizens' hope using these four components, but also trying to see if how sensitive is hope to the changing circumstances of the conflict. And the second study, so the first study, was aimed to answer the first and the second research questions. And then the second study was an experimental study that was aimed to answer the third and the fourth research questions. And I tried to test interventions and see if I could induce hope for peace, but also examine the durability of these interventions across political turmoil. So that was a two-wave survey experiment. And the initial plan was to launch two simultaneous studies, one in the occupied territories and one in Israel proper, in order, of course, to look at both sides. It was very essential. but logistical problems and financial problems and some political challenges made me, together with the chair and the committee members, decide to focus only on the Jewish Israeli population and save that sample because it was impossible at the time to conduct the study in the occupied territories. And I fixed this with another project, but in this project, it was only focused on the Jewish Israelis. So just quickly, how I measured hope when I'm looking at wish and expectations. I first ask people to rate how much they wish the following propositions to materialize, and there were 3 definitions of peace. I won't go over into these definitions, but they were made to encompass, in one way, a very generic understanding of peace. So you could imagine any type of peace, 2-stage solution, 1-stage solution, and then any other type of peace, and still these definitions will be relevant, but not, for example, envision peace as something like expelling the other. And there are some people that's how they understand peace. If the other will be expelled or exterminated, that will be peace. So I first gauge how much people wish for peace, and then after some questions, introduce the same propositions, and then ask them to make this assessment of the likelihood of peace, and that, of course, gauges the expectations for peace. So tapping those 2 components separately. Then to gauge hopeful emotions, I ask mostly about the feelings of people when they imagine the future, how much they are hopeless versus how much they are hopeful versus how much they are hopeless or desperate. And commitment to act was very tricky because I didn't want to ask people in the survey, how much would you support such and such peace-building project, how much you support negotiation, etc. Because people tend to just mark it because it's just hypothetical. They are not really engaged in any commitment. So what I did is okay, the surveys were online. I forgot to mention that the surveys were online surveys. And at the end of the survey, when participants clicked the exit button, suddenly there was a pop-up window of a mock web page that I constructed beforehand. And it looked like this pop-up windows that suddenly pop up or are presented on our screen. And it was an appeal by an Israeli-Palestinian soccer team. It's something that I invented, but it looked real for the participants, of a non-professional soccer team. And the appeal said, hi, we are a Palestinian-Israeli soccer team. We've been playing soccer, and through our love to sports and soccer, we also get to know each other. Please support our peace initiative. We have been shortlisted by the United Nations to participate in this online competition open to everybody, and the more stars we get just from the general public, the higher the chances we will get some funding for our activities. Please support our peace initiatives. This is very important for us. And participants could see this and really not like and not want to support it at all, and then allocate 0 star, not support it at all. But they could say, yeah, this is something I support, and I'll give it 1 star or 5 stars to increase the chances of this team to win the competition. The important thing here is that participants were feeling that they were impacting a real-world peace initiative. And that helped me to come closer, not exactly, of course, to come closer to capturing how much they are committed to peace. And of course, there are some problems with it, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so for the results, assessing hope for peace, and what I did in this presentation is gathered, I think, 30 pages of results into 1 or 2 graphs. So it's quite it doesn't have all the nuances, but looking at all of the components, we could see that people are quite hopeless when they are reporting their feelings. Their expectations for peace are quite low. So this is a 0 to 5 scale, with 2.5 being the midpoint. So expectations for peace are very low. And the commitment to act was also low. People did not really support this peace initiative and allocated not a high number of stars. But the wishes for peace are quite high. So at least we have one prerequisite, which is the wish for peace. And that complements the findings from other studies that I also report. Another thing we saw is that political ideology, but not any other demographic that I collected, like age and gender, predicted hope for peace, such that those that are more leaning to the right wing, that have more hawkish attitudes, have lower wishes for peace and lower expectations for peace. And that also makes sense. And many attitudes and behaviors could be predicted by people's political ideology, where they identify themselves on this continuum between being dove and being hawk. Of course, that makes sense as well. But when I looked into the question of sensitivity of hope during conflict escalation, so 4 hours after I collected the data, there was a terrible incident in the West Bank that sparked a conflict escalation and a surge of violence in the occupied territories and in Israel proper. There were arrests, there were people injured, there were Palestinians killed, and Jewish Israelis, civilian injured, and just what we see from time to time in Israel-Palestine, just a surge of violence. And I had the opportunity, the unfortunate opportunity, after 6 or 7 days of escalation, to tap hope for peace once again and see if there was some sort of change. And the main finding was that there was almost no change in people's hope for peace on almost all of the components. There was a slight change in one of them, but generally speaking, the levels of hope did not correspond with this surge of violence. And I'll talk a little bit later about the implications. Okay, now going into study 2, the experimental study that attempted to induce hope for peace. So the questions were, can we induce hope for peace? And will these hope-inducing intervention withstand conflict escalation? And in this study, there were more than 500 people that participated in an online study. And they answered the same questions as you saw before, but they answered after they saw a short video. The sample was divided into 5 groups. One group was a control group that didn't see any intervention. And there were, the other groups were randomly assigned to see 4 types of conflict interventions. And my aim was to see if these interventions can influence the levels of hope for peace. And this is how the interventions look like. This is the first intervention. So about 100 people saw this guy in a 2-minute video that looked like a homemade video, some guy talking to his webpage, like these movies that we frequently see on the internet. And he said that his name is Suleiman. He's a Palestinian from the West Bank, talked a little bit about his political opinions, and then said that he thinks that though it's very challenging and there are many obstacles, peace will be achieved at the end. Some agreement will be made. He did not say that he wants that. He did not say that he wants to meet Israelis, empathetic to their cause, nothing like that. Just his assessment of the likelihood of peace, that at the end it will be possible. So about 1/5 of the sample saw this guy. Another group saw exactly the same text, exactly the same outlook into the future, conveyed by a Jewish Israeli communicator. So this guy is an outgroup. This guy is the perceived enemy as far as Jewish Israelis are concerned. And this guy is one of their own, a Jewish Israeli, talking in their language, saying exactly the same text word for word, that peace is possible and agreement can be reached. And for methodological reasons, I also had to expose participants to pessimistic outlooks. So the other parts of the sample were divided between people that saw a skeptic Suleiman, exactly the same word but the opposite, peace is impossible and agreement will never be reached, and some people saw an in-group say that peace is impossible. And what are the results? The main results, and here I'm summarizing again many things, that optimistic outlooks that are conveyed by the perceived enemy, by this guy that you distrust and you dislike. Increase participants' hopeful emotions, wishes for peace, and expectations for peace. And if we look at the graph, and here I'm just exemplifying with hopeful emotions, but similar trends were also found on wishes and expectations. So here on the right, we see the levels of hopeful emotions among those that saw the outgroup communicator. Let's see, like this. No. The outgroup communicator, the Palestinian. And here are the levels of hopeful emotions among those that saw the Jewish Israeli, where the dashed lines here, the diagonal lines, are the optimistic outlooks, and the dark, no. Okay, and the darker lines, the pessimistic outlooks. And we could see that the optimistic outlooks generated higher hopeful emotions, especially those that were conveyed by the Palestinian communicator. What's interesting is that when I put the levels of hope of the control group, and this corresponds roughly to the levels of hope in the general Jewish Israeli population, because the sample were representative of the population, we could see that only the optimistic outgroup communicator managed to increase hope for peace above the general population. The optimistic in-group communicator, though he was conveying exactly the same message, didn't really increase hopeful emotions. Another interesting finding is that the skeptical outlooks didn't decrease hopeful emotions lower than the baseline, probably because these outlooks are just common knowledge. This guy is telling me that peace is impossible. That's no news. Of course peace is impossible, okay? So that didn't really change the levels of hope, could not decrease them. But this is a good finding because it shows that we can induce hope when it is conveyed by an outgroup communicator. But the interventions had no significant effect on the support for peace building, on this component of commitment to act for peace. So 3 components were affected, but maybe one of the most important components, some behavioral outcome, was not reached or did not reach statistical significance in this survey. And then there was a second survey. Like I said, there was a surge of violence, and I also used that to see if the interventions, if the effects of the interventions still lasted after 6 or 7 days of high volume and high intensity of violence. So the same respondents were contacted in a seemingly unrelated survey and were again asked about their hopes for peace. And the main findings is that the effect of the intervention withstood the escalation. So those people who saw the optimistic outgroup communicator, just a guy saying there is hope for peace, there is some possibility of that, that still raised their levels of hope for peace was still higher because of that intervention, even after 6 days of escalation. Another interesting finding is that the effects on the commitment to act suddenly emerged. So those who saw the optimistic outgroup communicator a week earlier tended to support the binational team more than the other groups. And just to exemplify, these are the levels, these are the percentage of people in each group that supported, even with 1 star, supported the binational team. And this is the control group, and this is in the second wave. And the control group, less than 50% supported the binational team, gave any number of stars, 1 or 2 or 5. Most of them, 51%, gave 0. And this is very similar to the first, the results from the first wave. But these are the levels of support in the other groups. And as you can see, those who saw the optimistic outgroup a week earlier, maybe they even forgot about the videos, tended to support the binational team. 2/3 of them, more than 2/3, tended to support the binational team in some way. And look at the support on the other groups. So we see here that there is some consequences, behavioral consequences, even though they are small. You know, it's just supporting on lines, giving some stars to an Israeli-Palestinian soccer team. It's not, the commitment is not that big. But still, there is some hint or suggestion that we could induce hope, and then it will also influence people's behaviors. So what does that mean? if we look at the expectations for peace, we said that the expectations for peace are low, but it's a prerequisite, right? The expectations for peace, this is in the second wave. More than half of the people thought that peace is impossible or almost impossible. So it's very hard to work with these people, to engage, to get them interested in any peace-building project, dialogue group, interested in listening to political parties that want to promote peace. It's hard to even get them interested because the prerequisite of peace is somehow possible is absent. They think that peace is impossible. The rest of the people here, okay, we could work with them even though their hopes might be quite low or their expectation might be low, it's still not impossible. And this is what happens after the intervention. So we reduce the number of people that are so skeptical that are hard to work with or even impossible, and we increase the number of people that could be approached, that could be, their attitudes could be changed, or some condition at least is present that these attitudes could be changed. So we increase the number of people that are will be more open to constructive ways to dealing with conflict, just because we decrease their skepticism. And this is maybe one of the things, this is the aim of this project in many ways. Looking at this on this cycle, we see that we manage to increase hope with this intervention, which is quite artificial, but it just gives us a hint to what we can do. And then we manage in some small way to increase constructive behaviors towards peace. And of course, next projects would need to examine this cycle more thoroughly in a more expansive way. So the conclusions, hope for peace is indeed one of the sources of resolution, not only as an outcome. Again, this hints to this, and much more research needs to be done to really understand what it means. It's just a suggestion here. And then the perceived enemy, which is usually understood as an obstacle for peace, is actually very instrumental in inducing hope for peace among the other group. And that could be further examined in terms of theory and empirical research, and of course has some implications into peace building. The contributions in terms of the literature, so the scholarly contributions, first of all, the study lends empirical support to the theories that placed in irreconcilability as one of the core features of intractability. So Bartal wrote a lot about it, and others, but it was not empirically investigated. It rectifies this conceptual confusion in the literature about hope, because I gauged the components separately, and hopefully further research on hope will cite my articles that differentiate between these two components. But also, I think I offer a novel approach to researching, to conflict analysis and resolution, because in this study, we are trying to understand the dynamics of conflict by looking at citizens' perceptions about the future trajectory of it. So looking at hope and hopelessness as one of the predictors of conflict escalation or de-escalation and peace. And just ending with the application, so hope inducement as a strategy could be incorporated by peace builders into curricula, workshop, dialogue groups, and projects to start to carve a pathway. It's like a window. We discovered a small window, okay? The wall is very big and it's thick, but we discovered a small opening that we could do by this hope inducement strategy in order to facilitate the conditions for future peace. And the media campaigns, the videos, could serve as prototypes or blueprints for real media campaigns, now distributed, much more elaborate media campaigns. This is just a prototype distributed among people that are embroiled in intractable conflicts, and try to tweak this perceived irreconcilability in order to make the environment more conducive to resolution. Future directions of my studies. So first of all, I really want to improve the empirical design. There were many problems, I think, or things that I want to improve in future in terms of methodology and tools in future projects. Some of these improvements I already addressed in another study that I did beyond this dissertation that was, first of all, also examining Palestinians' hope for peace, and it was much larger sample and much more sophisticated tools to gauge hope. So most of these things I already addressed. But also I want to apply this paradigm to other conflicts and conflict settings. It could be other intractable conflicts or other ethno-national conflicts, but it could also be conflicts within society, domestic conflicts, for instance, here in the USA that revolve around race or revolve around xenophobia, and try to see how we could measure hope for change, hope to end racism, and if we could intervene and then induce hope and increase the chances to resolve these conflicts in constructive ways. And that's it. So if you have any questions, I'd love to answer.
Jim, if you'd like to take the first kind of round for the committee? Sure. Great.
I enjoyed it, Adomi. First, a quick comment. I'm going to give you a chance to do your application for hope to a different setting and think about it a little bit. But first, your hope to be an astronaut?
I don't. Oh. But there are other things I hope, I wish to be, but I don't hope.
Well, just by coincidence, last week we looked at the percentage of foreign-born who happen to be astronauts, and it's double the proportion of foreign-born in the country. So your chances
I have a chance.
Your chances
okay.
are good.
It really depends on you if you guys...
It could be a third career. No, the two intractable conflicts I know the best, one of them West Germany, East Germany, and the other India-Pakistan. And both of them have strong sort of similarities to the case you're talking about because they both involve the development of parallel states at the exact same time. Okay, so there's a good opportunity to think here. And then if you look about East Germany, West Germany, it was resolved. And the people who led the resistance in East Germany, they were spokespeople for the West. It was the church. Okay, so here, your theory's looking pretty good here. So let's go to India and Pakistan.
Let's go to India and Pakistan with your help.
So let's think about what kind of intervention could you imagine that would make this first of all, a good thing for the world, but second of all, to test your theory?
So thanks for this question, and these are things that I will want to think about starting this afternoon. And if we are talking about India, Pakistan, for example, so there are similarities, of course. The intensity of the conflict is different when you compare Israel and Israel, Palestine, and India, Pakistan. Of course, the two nations have atomic power. One of the things that evolved during this conflict is the nuclear capabilities, but the intensity of the day-to-day conflict is different. But I think they will find many similarities in the social psychological construct, in the levels of beliefs and emotions that could be found in both in the Indian and the Pakistani society. But I think the first thing I'll have to do is learn. You cannot think that you could apply just, it's one size fits all, just cut and then put it, copy and paste. I will have to learn both from literature and I think from on-ground experience. What are the levels of hope for resolution among Indians and Pakistanis? And because these societies are so large, I am sure that there is such a diversity in people's approach to the conflict. So doing that will be an amazing project. And then after you understand what are the levels, you need to think, okay, what will be the intervention? So I would look at it as a two-step project. One, assessing current levels of hope for peace using these four components, and then starting to design an intervention and piloting it. These video interventions are actually, I think, the second or the third generations of interventions that I already used. Some of them proved non-efficient. So for example, when Jewish Israelis read an article read by conflict experts saying that Israeli conflict resembles other conflicts that were eventually resolved, that didn't affect them at all. So as conflict experts, we are not that powerful in persuading people. But these needs to, it's like a trial and error until you formulate and refine an intervention. And these interventions are by no means final. I could definitely improve them and make them more efficient. So I would gladly work with you on that. That would be an honor and a privilege.
Good, thank you. Any other questions? I'll let Kevin ask one, and then I got one other big one. But
Sure. Yeah, first, let me say, kind of editorially, that it was really a pleasure to sit on the committee in many ways. Yours was a paradigmatic example to me of how a research project, a doctoral research project, develops and matures. Maybe you were in my 801 class, I think the last one that I taught, and I remember you showing me those 4 videos and talking to me about what the kind of intervention was, and talking about hope, and of course that was kind of insightful, but methodologically and conceptually naive. And what I've seen over the years is how, in both the methodological sense and, to me, equally importantly, in the conceptual sense, the project just got stronger and stronger and more convincing. And I think there certainly are ways, and you know them better than anyone, in which you can refine your empirical model, the design, so that it gets even better. But it really developed almost paradigmatically as a doctoral research project should. I think I played a very small role in that compared to Jim and Thomas, but it was a pleasure to kind of stand there and hold your coat while you did that. So I have questions that puzzled me, your findings, and obviously in answering some of these, it's completely speculative, or maybe it's something that you'd want to look at in the next phases. But I was truly surprised that age, but more importantly, gender, did not seem to affect findings. And I wonder if you could just speculate about that, because there is, so much social psychological literature that begins to manipulate variables in quasi-experimental settings. And typically, age and gender are 2 of the biggies, right, to show some kind of variance. So could you just speculate on why you think age and gender didn't seem to have any statistically significant effects?
I could not only speculate, but I could give you a very precise answer.
Good, that's even better.
Because fortunately, again, in my other project, in the Hope Map project, I had a much larger sample size, and sampling apparatus was much more robust, and then gender and age did have an effect on wishes and expectations, in the way that we could assume women were more hopeful than men, both on the wish component and the expectation component. And the older one is the more one, the wishes are higher and the expectations are higher. And one of the problems in this study is that the sample was relatively small, so the brushes are quite wide, and smaller differences could not be observed. And the sampling apparatus was not as robust, and there are many, not many, but there are flaws in the setting, which I elaborate in the dissertation. And by improving that, in the Hope Map project, I show that, of course, political orientations, one ideology, is the strongest predictor of hope. Gender and age matter. Religiosity matters as well, over and above political orientation. But income and levels of education do not.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. And of course, I couldn't help when I was reading it, and you said this had to be online, and that was a limitation. All I could see was that, classic Chicago Tribune thing, Dewey wins, because it was all telephone stuff. And of course, by only doing it online, in terms of a face, a surface insight, you probably left out the Haredi community, the kind of ultra-Orthodox, who are at least conceptually prohibited from using the internet at all. And it might have also had some socioeconomic class implications, which might be connected to the Ashkenazi-Mizrahi divide. So again, this is a limitation that you're aware of, but I think that it's a limitation that affected your sample in a number of different ways, and it's something that I hope you will address later on.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks. Indeed, doing an online survey has its limitations. The advantages are just budget, so that's the budget I had. I have to say that what we try to do is correct for these imprecise sampling in all sorts of ways. So for example, polling companies have a huge pool of participants, 80,000 participants, and I could ask, I need to pay for it, that Haredi will be there and Ashkenazi, and so the social-economical divide is supposed to be, this gap is supposed to be mitigated somehow, and the religious gap is supposed to mitigate it somehow, and then I also reweigh them afterwards, because I know the amount of Haredi, for instance, in the population, and I could adjust it. Now, these adjustments are not the best way to do it. They are the most precise way to do a sampling is something that costs a lot of money. But as the more funding I get, the more precise my sampling will be, I hope, wish and expect.
Yeah, I've got one.
Okay.
I can go last.
Yeah, it kind of follows on to Kevin's, because again, the work we have been doing where we show the interviewer effects, and that they're, and it sort of shows the importance of, if you have an interviewer there with the same identity or same identity group, you're going to answer differently. So even in a face-to-face interview setting, you've got that possibility of social desirability and giving the responses they think the other person wants to hear. And now, with your passion for social psychology, you had to realize beyond the interviewer, okay, in crowds with other people. So how do you think this, your hopeful findings, and I think they are, how do you then test, are they going to persist outside the study setting? External validity question.
Small question.
Yeah, that's that.
General or about his project?
This is a great question, and in many ways it's not only a methodological question. For me, it's an important question because we want people here in ESCAR are committed to engage in their society to make change. So we want to make real change, not only real journal articles. And one of the things that I plan to do, and there are new paradigms which are really eye-opening. For example, in one study that was also conducted together with a professor I'm going to do the postdoc with, they took a whole city and they compared two cities that had similar socioeconomical backgrounds and other backgrounds. And in one city, they launched a campaign on billboards, on bus stops. People were distributing flyers, of course not aware that it was any experimental. And then they tapped it was something else. But there are some paradigms that could help us really increase the scope of the generalizability of the findings. And in other aspects, I will say that I will never know. And I will try, it's like when marketers try to evaluate a slogan or a logo or a new product, they have their sampling, and then they take from this knowledge and then they apply it to the general public. Most of the time it works because they had the initial findings that it will work. Sometimes it's a flop. I hope that I will get enough, how did it jump here? I will get enough data and also from other investigations of hope-inducing interventions to devise a real campaign and then just launch it and hope for the best, So, but indeed, it's something. It's always going to be a question: the generalizability of the findings.
Well, you do think that's the right direction to go in this big setting?
Yeah. It is. It encouraged me to continue to investigate it. Okay, so I want to be cautious. The findings here don't in any way suggest that we found the key to resolution. Don't suggest that hope is the strongest way to go about, or is the most effective way to go about in creating a constructive constructive sentiment in the public. And also that these interventions are the best we can do. It lends some hint. It's an initial hint. I will say, just to continue on that one of the paradigms that I want to test is the social contagiousness of hope. So people here, they saw an online survey, saw some intervention, they were on their own. But we have reasons to believe that in a group setting, hope could be contagious. Like hopelessness is contagious. When people are despair, it affects, are desperate, it affects many people. We think that hopefulness could be socially contagious, that you start in a group to be more hopeful just because you're in a setting of a group. And there are two paradigms that I want to test in that sense. So it's another way.
My question builds on that answer.
Please.
I'll just preface, just like Jim and Kevin did, how much fun this has been to be chair. So I don't know if I've ever learned so much being someone's chair for a dissertation. And this is it's like a sad day in a way for me, partially, mostly a very happy day. But to see to kind of knowing that you're moving on and we're going to be missing you here. And this is a paradigmatic, to use Kevin's word. I think marriage. We usually think of these things as being in conflict, of a normative commitment to peace building, which is exemplified in the first phases of your career and of the work you've done, with a similar commitment, almost equally as passionate, to good social science. We usually think of these things as being in conflict, and I think your work shows an example of how these things can coexist, and actually can not just coexist, right? Can actually actively support each other in ways. I think there's just a good example to PhD students, to the discipline more broadly. But now that said, my question kind of starts with Jim's a little bit and then kind of varies a little bit, because it sort of the main question I have, I really only have one, and it just has variations on the one theme. Kind of starts also from a part of the dissertation in which, in the very end, you sort of characteristically, incisively said, here's some of the kind of the things I would do better, right, and things I am doing better now with the work I'm already doing. And one of the things you said was, I would like to think more carefully about hope theoretically. I think you already have in many ways. You're not giving yourself quite enough credit, but you said, I'm going to paraphrase you poorly, that you to think about hope as a system, as a complex, and what drives it and how does it derive from itself. And then that would help us to derive hypotheses that could be more carefully tested with the sorts of interventions you've already developed in the work here. And I think all my questions are really about that. Because I think that that's really, even differently from the methodological, from some of the methodological questions that all three of us have had along the way, is to my mind the biggest leap that the work can be taking from here, because this work is going to keep going. This is one step, right, in a much longer process. And so how does hope work as a system? So for example, how does it relate to real world events? Right, there's two scenarios you described, one in which hope is chronically low and one in which it responds to real world events, and then of course in turn shapes possibly real world events as well, right? Which kind of suggests that we get in hope traps, vicious circles, virtuous cycles as well. Do the components vary together, right? Do the cognitive aspects drive the emotional, or perhaps in some other way? And I'm thinking about someone that we've read a lot. I've read a lot because of you. Barthol's work, in which he sets out what he calls a conflict of ethos as a system. That's sort of there's a drawing. I made my undergraduates read this, right? There's a drawing and it kind of shows how the various components push each other. And I'm just wondering about how, if you have, and this is another sort of big question like Jim's, but do you have a sense of how you might be developing that kind of theoretical sense, and how that might change the empirical work in turn in the future? I've got one follow-up, but that's really my only.
So indeed that will be my main focus, both in theory and then trying to understand how I empirically examine the theory. But one thing, so there are two parts. I want to answer your question in two parts. First of all, in terms of a system, how do the components react to each other and how they influence each other is something that I need to work on, because here I only kind of separated them and identified them.
Which is already a step forward.
And then the question is, how do they correspond with one another? So I need to better understand the relationship between them, and this is something that I have in some way established better in my new project, but not analyzed it that thoroughly. The second thing is to understand what is the connection between hope and other beliefs and attitudes that could correspond either positively or negatively with. So just for example, one of the things someone that examined my research said, you're just talking about hope is like political efficacy, okay? Political efficacy and hope are the same. Are you sure you are measuring different constructs? And in the Hope Map project, what I did is measure political efficacy, which is the general belief of people that they have some ability to change the future, that they are not just pawns, but that public opinion matters, and people could have some impact on political situations. There are some people that are low on political efficacy. We think, okay, we are only pawns. And some people that are high in political efficacy means, yeah, people could make a change, public opinion matters to leaders, et cetera, et cetera. And what I saw, for example, is that political efficacy corresponds only with expectations and not with wishes. So the higher one's political efficacy, and this was examined, it was true both for Palestinians and for Jewish Israelis on a 1,000 with 1,000 people in the sample. So you could see that that's one way to look at it. What other kind of political attitudes, ideologies, general beliefs about life correspond with which of the different components of hope? And the third thing I will say is now to also test interventions that work and try to push different buttons. So this interventions was deliberately pushing the expectation button. It didn't say that we should desire peace more, that peace is beneficial. I could have devised or designed an intervention when the messenger is just talking about the merits of peace, not of its likelihood. peace is great, it's going to be beneficial for you, for us, etc., etc. That will be pushing the wish component. But I wanted to touch the expectation button because it was so low, and it just talks about the likelihood, right? So could I press what happens when I press different buttons? That will be a third way to examine, and there's, of course, a lot more to be done. The second part, to answer your question, has to do with the stability of hope in response to conflict, the reality of conflict. And I think one of the ways to exemplify this is to ask, okay, how heavy is this weight? Is it a big, huge, fat elephant that only 300 people, so a big change in the political climate, like a full-blown out war, for example, could decrease hope, or like the peace process of real peace process, could that big change push this big fat elephant? Or is it a small elephant that even, small changes in the fluctuations of conflict could push it? And what I see here is that it's quite a big elephant. So the weight is quite substantial. It did not move in this particular circumstances, which is one that of a week, of conflict escalation. And then the second thing, which is again has to do with the stability, is what could we do to move this elephant by a trick? So these are tricks, right? I didn't trick people, but these are external ways to influence hope for peace that do not count on the reality of the conflict. I don't want to count on the reality of the conflict to do the work for us. We want to intervene. So what kind of interventions could we do to move this elephant? And here I show that if I put a carrot, then the elephant moves its head and is maybe interested in moving. Like I found something that could not, we don't push it, but we do some interventions that this elephant could move. And here he didn't rise and start walking off the stage. That's what we want him, right? That skepticism will walk off the stage and people will be hopeful and work towards a resolution. But he moved his head and maybe did a small step. The more effective the interventions, the bigger the move this big chunk will do. So I am taking the results here very cautiously and just looking at them as initial steps.
If I can follow up with one last thing, and
Yeah,
then we
please.
can get to our audience. I can't help.
I have one more.
Okay, yeah, no, yeah, I can't. I don't know about y'all. I can't help myself. Really following up on Jim's question before mine, and thinking about what you just said. You're doing this in a micro setting, right? So we think it's sort of, there's a micro and the macro, and there's this meso, right? And you're doing this in a micro setting. You pointed this out yourself, that there's contagiousness, you can imagine focus groups in seeing how conversations evolve in a way that maybe, right, that sort of would be incredibly interesting. But I'm thinking a little bit about how social change happens, and in this sense, thinking a little bit about like the work of Erica Chenoweth, to take an example, right? And a lot of work now on that goes back decades on social movements, on how social change actually happens, and how organizations evolve to affect social change across time. And here in the United States, there's oftentimes analyses of the civil rights movement, right? But it's evolved in a lot of different ways in sociology and political science to different degrees. And so being the resident political scientist, I'm thinking a little bit about then how you think, or there seems to be this missing piece, and I'm asking you just to fill it in a little bit for me, right? How do we expect interventions? Imagine that we had a better, a really cool version of what you're talking about, with Suleiman and Shlomi, and evolve that into like a marketing campaign for peace. Right? I'm thinking about the movie No with Gael Garcia Bernal, right, about the referendum on the Pinochet, right, and essentially, on the dictatorship, and essentially they just had like bright rainbow colors, right, that just made people happy, and they voted no, right, and they linked no with happiness in this strong emotional way, and there was a moment that happened, and people voted against the dictatorship in this really interesting way. But I'm thinking also then about how social change happens, and you come from a peace building movement, that involves hard, painstaking work, that involves trying to get money, that involves trying to build alliances, that the hard work of advocacy. And I'm thinking a little bit about how the micro intervention that you're talking about, that's about sort of changing attitudes, changing emotions, changing beliefs in the general population, shifts that black box that to my mind is between those attitudinal changes and big, quote unquote, I don't like that word, big political change, right, real political change, which is that social organizing, social movement work that right now seems like the black box in between the interventions and the change, right? And I'm just wondering how you're, and again, I say this because you're a veteran, you're sort of in a sense a child of that.
I'm still involved, so I see myself as still in the ranks of. So that's a great question, and I don't have an immediate answer. And I'm always cautious because these things need to be investigated, and I need to learn the literature. But definitely, collective action is one way to look at it. If we induce hope, are people going out to the streets? Are people going to? Could we do that in this, with this approach, or in that direction? But I also want to say that the lack of hope for peace is not only absent in the publics, it's also absent in the leadership. So elites don't use, even in the left, don't use hope as a platform in their campaigns, as a message, as the skepticism is so prevalent and pervasive that no one either doesn't talk about peace at all, or is so cautious. No one says it's doable. No one will use this thing. It is possible. Yes, it's going to be hard, but it's possible. That's not a platform anymore, and it has not been since Rabin died or was assassinated. So for 20-something years. So in many ways, reviving this, suggesting leaders that they will reuse hope, and we know how hope is a very valuable political tool for leaders. Audacity to hope and other things that leaders used to gain momentum, to gain support, to push their agenda forward.
Ronald Reagan, in my lifetime in this country, in his Morning in America.
But this is not used anymore. It's absent in the political rhetoric of leaders. So that's another way to look at it. And the third thing is, and that's the big question. And I know this is something that we try to do in social psychology, and there have been several successful things to influence voting behavior. So if we induce hope for peace, will people change their voting behavior? I'm going to be in Israel-Palestine in March, and there are general elections. I hope with my new members of the lab that we could push some project forward and then see if there is some changing voting patterns. These are just optional ways, some options. I wish I could do them all, but I don't know. But it's going back to what you said, and I appreciate your what you said about connecting rigorous methods to an agenda. This is in many ways what I am. I want to take whatever knowledge we could generate, empirically test, scrutinize, really, and then make it as a product that will facilitate peace in all sorts of settings. And in many ways, if you look at people that are researching, or the NIH, my wife Yasmin works at the NIH, right? People in the NIH are doing rigorous work. Thousands of people, thousands of researchers are doing rigorous work in order to be implemented. It doesn't have almost any value if you just there needs to be a medicine at the end, there needs to be some medical procedure at the end in order to improve the welfare of people. And we have to make the similar, in many ways, the similar attempt, because we are also dealing with, there are lives at stake, and we need to embrace our theory. It could also be done with theory, it doesn't have to be with empirical research, but we need this component of applicability, because I think this is what being an SCAR means, or being a conflict scholar means. So this is what I wish and expect.
And behavior. Sorry, Kevin.
Yeah, well, just a observation in terms of developing what Thomas referred to as hope itself as a kind of cultural or social psychological system. So reflecting on the fact that when you followed up with your sample after conflict escalation, the levels didn't seem to change very, very much. So hope was your dependent variable there. But reflecting on what happened at Oslo, after Oslo, I think that was probably the period when there was on both sides the most hope. And then as it became apparent that Oslo failed in some essential way, then that, just impressionistically, that's when levels of violence, number of incidents, intensity of violence increased, particularly on the Palestinian side, because Oslo failed. There would be no immediate Palestinian state. Settlements continued. So that's thinking of hope as an independent variable. That is, what are the consequences of having hope reach a certain level and then having it be frustrated? The failure of hope is kind of the sibling study to what inducing hope is. And in fact, inducing hope and then having hope be frustrated and fail might be more dangerous for the conflict than not inducing hope, right?
So I thank you for that question, and this was a theme from the onset of the project that you always promoted me to think about. What happens when hopes are dashed? And also, what are the ethical considerations here? Should we induce hope for peace, make people, think that peace is possible, and then the reality is so dire, and so many futile attempts, that proved just, and then the hopes are dashed, and maybe that's more dangerous. So
and my final thought, and we talked about this very, very briefly, was that I thought a lot as I read your final drafts about the Milgram experiments, more even than about the Zimbardo ones. And, Milgram kind of had many, many, many experiments that he varied this and varied that, and varied gender, varied age, varied the amount of discomfort that the person was feeling, and published those as kind of discrete articles in the social psychological canon, in the culture. But what he did, because he was really not just doing social psychology, but engaging with a deeply moral question that came out of the Holocaust in many, many ways, was he then brought it together in the book, Obedience to Authority, where he took the empirical stuff and then really used it to reflect upon really deep moral questions. And my expectation of you, and my hope and my wish, is that as you continue this, particularly with the Hope Map project, that you do what many social psychologists don't do or can't do, or just think that people like Malcolm Gladwell do it and it's popular science. And that is that you really use this work at some point, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, to engage in a book, in a treatment where you do what most social psychologists don't do. I think you have a little footnote where you say there's a kind of allergy to engage moral questions right, or to engage questions about activism and peace building and all of that, that at some point you really use this increasingly powerful and robust work to do what Milgram did in the book and not just in a series of articles. And that's my hope and my wish and my expectation.
That is my hope and my wish as well. And I hope to do it sooner than 5 years. And I did not expect that I will be so attracted to the really thick theory and moral questions behind hope. I thought, okay, I'll do that. I love the experiments. Okay. But when I was writing the dissertation and when I was reading the work of the thinkers, that really kind of engaged my curiosity. And what I want to offer is really a comprehensive examination of this question of the role of hope. Also looking at it in a critical way, because as you say, it might be not beneficial all the times. And looking at it from an ethical perspective, from a cultural perspective, we know that cultures value hope differently, and we need to encompass that also in the work. And philosophy, theology, history, how the trajectory of conflict, the historical trajectory of the conflict relate to the hopes, and trying to locate the exact point where we understand what it means. So.
I think Mark Gopin deserves a little bit of credit for pushing you in that direction. Your comprehensive exam. I remember Mark pushing you to think about, what have Jewish and Palestinian, Arabic, religious authorities, intellectuals, what have they said about hope over time? And I remember you.
Mark was great. So many other people,
exam,
each from their own perspective. And
Jim, any more? No, I'm good. We have a lovely audience who came. So, Chip.
I came with a whole bunch of methodological questions, and they all kind of evaporated, except for half of one. A comment and then a question about intervention. If you look at what was done and is probably going to be done again about what happened to the New Left of the 60s, of which I'm a part, a lot of us who did research about why that disappeared would have gotten at the efficacy issue, the expectation end of what you're calling hope. And so if you look at, there's a dissertation done by a guy named Charles Tenenbaum about the peace movement, peace building process in the US, in which I think he talks about the people who hang on are the people who maintain that expectation side of the hope. And it's certainly my anecdotal evidence of my generation of lefties who were still active, the Todd Gitlins of the famous, on the high end, but people like me on the grassroots level, we kept that sense of expectation. But what the question I have is about the intervention. So my methodological training is experiments are wonderful, but political scientists can't do them because you can't work in labs. And so I'm drawn to these interventions. And I'm drawn by the fact that you spent some time with William Barber over the weekend. And I had the privilege of spending a day with him.
I was one of many people in the audience in this march, together with my 6-year-old son, by the way.
So, but in the afternoon, I spent with Reverend Barber with a group of pretty much lefty academics who were interested in the fate of democracy in the U.S. We lapped it up. It was incredible. I wonder how that kind of intervention might work in this kind of a context, compared to, I assume you know Ronnie Edry?
I know Ronnie I know him personally.
Right. So Ronnie has done this terrific, cool project of Israel Loves Iran that has had a gazillion hits on the internet, but probably has had no lasting impact. So what is the the kind of intervention on the basis of what you've seen that might push the elephant a bit more. You know, I've had the privilege of working with both of these guys. But what, on the basis of what you've learned and your gut impression, which is not something one talks about in dissertations very often, but you know, where is the practical implication of this, do you think?
It's a good question, and I have been trying and also succeeding in some ways when I met people that are working, or leaders, CEOs of organizations that are working in Israel-Palestine. First of all, to try to reintroduce hope into their work. And they admit that that hope was absent in their curricula, in anything. It was maybe because it's seen like a no-no, or it's kitsch maybe, talking about that it's possible, right? The idea that eventually there will be a change, or because they are too much absorbed in the their day-to-day struggle, these NGOs, that they could come with hope as one of their leading slogans. But I was talking to many of them, and they said, yes, we have neglected this, and we should reincorporate it. There are many people, they said themselves, that in terms of their politics would love to engage in our work, but they are just skeptics. What's the use? Peace will never come about. The conflict is here to stay, et cetera, et cetera. So reintroducing this might get them back in. So that's one way to look at it, and a more micro level, And another thing we need to understand that I need to contribute to the change. I don't have this presumption, that I will be the change. I want to contribute to it, right? Or hope will not be the change, will contribute to the change. And the second thing is really to engage in leadership, with leadership. And the upcoming general elections are a good opportunity to do that. And what I could do or want to do is, again, looking at the applicable end, I want to serve those that know how to run the politics. I don't think I could. I don't want to be a politician. I will not succeed. But I want to be a scholar that wants to serve these people to, when we have mutual agendas, of course, that to serve them with these interventions, for example. So these could be blueprints of media campaigns that could be launched before the elections. And having an outgroup member, have a Palestinian do that. That's, for example, one of the novel findings. We think most of the literature on persuasion said never use your opponent. He will never be persuasive. An in-group that shares your culture and the language that you trust will be the most persuasive one. But the findings, and based on other theoretical paradigms, show otherwise. So using Palestinians as the communicators of hope to an Israeli public before the elections might do or contribute to a shift or some shift. But that's, I will always be in that junction of how do I implement that, how do I help, how do I contribute, and how do I expand my knowledge, how do I make more precise interventions, more durable.
On from that point, so I like the idea of hope, and it's something positive, and if it's able to change the trajectory of conflict, it's something that should be done. But to what extent is that also engineering people's perceptions? Are there ethical dimensions to being able to say, this is the message you as a politician need to be getting out to people? Because I can imagine someone coming up with the opposite message, really, that helps continue the conflict, continue the divisions that people have between them. So to what extent are you, yes, you're engineering something positive, but to what extent is that also providing tools for someone else who might be able to produce the opposite message?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
one
yeah.
question. And then my second question is, you're able to do follow-up surveys. So like, how did you identify those participants? Like, I think you mentioned that you used like a company that had participants, and so that's where you're generating your sample from. But I'm interested in how that reaching out to people again and asking them to participate in the survey. How did that happen, and how did you, I guess, go about that?
So thanks. I'll first answer the second question, which is just more methodological. So there are many ways to go about it when you do a longitudinal research or waves. What I chose is to recontact the same people, the exact same people, but do it in a seemingly unrelated survey. So because of these people, they get invitations. They are in a pool. They're in a pool. This company has 80,000 people in their pool. And this pool of people gets invitations on a daily basis or 2-3 times a week to participate in all sorts of studies, including studies on consumer preferences or all sorts of things. And they just get an email, and then if they accept it, they do the survey. And there are advantages and disadvantages of going back to the same people. But what I try to do is differentiate between the studies as much as possible. So the graphics of it looked completely different. I used not only different fonts, but there was like a different logos, and everything looked really like a different researcher did these studies. And because they are very common, these kind of studies, the ability to associate between these studies from the perspective of participants was low. And I also had some way also to measure it. I won't go into that, but I have a good kind of feeling that the studies were not associated. There is a more robust way to do that if I had a bigger budget. And the way that the computerized apparatus that this company has knows to locate the same people without them understanding that they've been identified, in any way. It's just a random. They get an invitation. Also, because of that, there is attrition. Some people do not saw this invitation, and the second time didn't want to do it because they didn't have the time. So that's one of the disadvantages of going back to the same people. And then in the bigger question you asked, the ethical question and the political question. So I'll divide it into two things. First of all, the interventions are not deceiving in a sense that they provide some false information or generate some false promises. This guy apparently is not a leader. You saw him, he's just a random guy talking to his webcam. He can't make any promises on behalf of leadership, or he's not a decision maker. He doesn't expose new information, which is deceptive on the ability to do peace. It's just reintroducing something that we forgot, which is peace is possible, this idea. Now, in many ways, yes, it is, I don't know if it's engineering, but it is trying to persuade people. I have some intention to persuade people, to open people to the possibility of future peace, because I want to make some change. So it is in many ways, it's not completely sterile in my approach. And I'm happy that way. So I want to make some change, but it's important. And Kevin also always made this kind of warned me about these ethical, and rightly so, the ethical restrictions I have to put upon myself in order to make, and there's a balance here. So there was no deceiving information, for example. And of course, the participants were debriefed afterwards. But then going back to the political game, people's minds are engineered all the time. And in many ways, in these times, they are engineered to an unbelievable, the scope of engineering is crazy, I think. When we live in the world of tweets and the world of, it is always happening. I think we need to be more bold in our engagement with politics if we want to sell, quote unquote, peace or resolution or compassion or acceptance or whatever. We want to sell these things. We want to know how to sell them well. We can't just be, naive about how the world works. And if we are conflict analysis and resolution, we also have to be engaged in the resolution, understand how people think and engage that. And I just will add that as much as I'm engaged in Israeli-Palestinian politics, one of the things that happened during these 5 years, and that was a great privilege just being here in ESCAR, is being more and more engaged in tensions and disputes inside of the American society. Now, I have a lot to learn, but I have been involved in things that are also happening now in the United States, and try to, as much as possible, try to lend my approach to the things that are concerning every one of us in the American society. I think we need to be a bit more bold. Cautious, but bold.
Thanks, Adomi. I really appreciate your presentation. Very impressed, and it was awesome to see you go through this process. And I got to work with you a little bit on the hope management issue. My question is more process question, methodological, following on Sandhu's question about ethics and mention of Milgram. And you mentioned that you did debrief the subjects. I was curious about the football giving the stars. Did you go back and speak to the people who gave stars to say this was a fictional team? And I just want to know, did you do that? If you did, what was the process of that? What were their reactions when you shared that this was a fictional team? And I imagine they might have been buoyed by the idea that of the potential for hope being raised by this sort of thing. But I just wanted to.
Yeah. So good question. So first of all of the people were debriefed afterwards, including the nature of the soccer team and the interventions. It was films made by us, and the soccer team was not real. It was just a way to process something, and that's a standard procedure in these circumstances, and was authorized by the IRB. So all the process, very painstaking process of detailing the IRB, what exactly and what point is it going to be done. And by the way, I needed to debrief at the second wave. So people were under the impression for a full week that they, for example, supported or not supported this soccer team, right?
You didn't debrief in the first wave.
I didn't debrief in the first wave, but it was authorized by IRB. Specifically, you said it's going to be a time gap, and so there are some things here, but it was, done in the process, done the IRB process. It's important to debrief. I was now involved in a study that we frightened people. We're trying to see, because we're talking about hope, so one way to push the elephant is hope, another way is to scare him, right? So if we want to make some change, we could scare people into negotiations. That's a study, if we could scare people into negotiating. And so people were reading fictional articles of an attack coming soon from the Palestinian side, and in that instance, we decided, before even going to IRB, decided not to do a longitudinal study, so people will not be with this threat for a full week or any time. And we debriefed them right after they read the mock articles. So the ethical concerns are always there. IRB may be a bit of a bother, but it's important that we are in line with the rules and the standards of social science. And with the boundaries from IRB, I want to try to be in the boundaries, but not be afraid. You know, we are dealing with serious stuff. We are dealing with people, you know, with death. We are dealing with war. We are dealing with people losing their families. We need to be, I think, bolder in our attempt to influence that as much as possible.
Any other questions? Oh, Molly?
So you discovered a really important finding about needing to have the other side be a voice rather than just simply from your own in-group. If we're going to be creating peace, what is it specifically? What are the characteristics of this person? Is it the person? Is it what they're saying? Is it, what is your hypothesis specifically about the nature and construction of this person? Is it their position? Is it that they're saying something that I agree with? That sounds great, I'm going to win at the next negotiation because they're capitulating. What is the characteristic that's there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I could answer that only partially because I need to, you know, everything, if I want to answer correctly, I need the empirical evidence for that. What we know now, at least on these interventions, that the nationality, just the nationality of the speaker was very important. All of the actors were directed to convey the message in similar ways, not more enthusiastic than the other. Okay, so I was there and trying to kind of equalize all of the passions and the stresses on the words. Everything had to be, the films were identical except for the messenger and the conviction pieces, possible or impossible. But for example, in an earlier study that I published together with Thomas, we had two Suleimans. We had one Suleiman that said he was a former militia member that was engaged in hostile activities against the IDF, et cetera, but now he believes that peace is possible. And we had someone that said that he was a peace activist and worked with Jewish Israelis on all sorts of peace projects, and he thinks that peace is possible. So two histories of this person, and there was no difference. We thought there would be a difference, that the former militia member would be more convincing because he made this change. He was once a cruel enemy. Now he believes that peace is possible. Again, not that peace is good or that he wants peace, but peace is possible. And the other one is just consistent. He was a peace activist and still believes it. But there was no change, and maybe because this character of being from the opponent's side is so big that it doesn't really matter inside who is this person. But this is just partial, because gender may be an issue, and if it's a female speaker, it could be pushing different buttons and then doing something else. And very correctly, if it's a person of some political prominence, it could be different, because we see, okay, this is a politician, he represents people, and he's a decision maker. So maybe that will increase hopes more. But maybe we could say, okay, he's a politician, you know. They always lie, they have their reasons. This is just a lay person, just a random guy. We should believe him more. So all these need to be tested. And one of the things that I want to do is really expand and do gender and do position in order to understand what it is about the messenger. But you really correctly identified that it's not only the message, that who is speaking it, who is conveying it is really, really important. So thanks.
Any other questions? Well done.